Her husband laughed when he saw her defending herself in court. But his smile didn't last long. The courtroom doors opened with a low, resonant creak that seemed to swallow all conversation. Eloane Dariel Isidore stepped through the threshold alone, her fingers wrapped around a slim leather folder that had seen better days, corners softened by handling, edges worn to a lighter brown. Her dress was charcoal gray, simple in cut, appropriate for the occasion but unremarkable. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, modest 2-inch pumps that suggested practicality over presentation. Nothing about her entrance commanded attention. Nothing about her appearance suggested danger. Welcome to Stories by Jason. If you're settled in and ready for a good story, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I've got another exciting story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for the love and support. You're truly appreciated, and I'm so grateful to have you here with me. Also, let me tell you something funny. Someone actually bet that I can't reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this year, and honestly, I want to prove them wrong. So if you're watching this right now and you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and join the family. Reaching 1,000 subscribers is a very personal goal for me, and your support would mean the world to me. Thank you for believing in me and being part of this journey. And before you go, drop your name and location in the comments. I'd love to give you a special shout-out in my next video. Introduction. Across the vast expanse of polished wood and brass fixtures sat Fenric Galen Isidore, her husband of 14 years. He occupied his chair the way he occupied every room, with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no and wouldn't recognize the word if he heard it. His suit was midnight blue, tailored to precision, the kind that whispered wealth without shouting it. His watch caught the overhead lights, a gleaming statement piece that cost more than most people's cars. His posture was relaxed, almost bored, one arm draped casually over the back of his chair as if he were at a business luncheon rather than a divorce proceeding. Beside him sat 3 attorneys, arranged like pieces on a chessboard. Navy suits, crisp white shirts, silk ties in coordinating shades. Their laptops were already open, screens glowing with prepared arguments and financial projections. Leather briefcases stood at attention beside their chairs. One attorney, a woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, tapped her pen against a legal pad in a rhythmic pattern that suggested impatience. Another, younger, scrolled through his phone with the glazed expression of someone performing a task beneath his skill level. The third, a man with graying temples and the sharp eyes of a predator, watched Eloane cross the room with clinical interest, the way a scientist might observe a lab rat navigating a maze. Eloane reached the defense table and set down her folder. The sound it made against the wood was soft, almost apologetic. She pulled out her chair, a motion that seemed to take longer than it should, as if the weight of 100 eyes made even simple movements difficult. She sat carefully, back straight, hands folded on the table in front of her. That's when Fenric saw it. The empty chair beside her. No attorney. No legal team. No laptops. No briefcases. No coordinated strategy sessions happening in urgent whispers. Just Eloane. And that worn leather folder. The laugh started low in his chest, a rumble of disbelief that broke into something audible. Not a roar. Fenric was too polished for that, but enough. Enough that heads turned. Enough that the woman in the gallery behind him leaned forward to see what had amused him. Enough that his lead attorney, the man with the predator's eyes, glanced over with a raised eyebrow before his lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but suggested satisfaction. The sound rippled through the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. A few gallery members exchanged glances. Someone coughed to cover what might have been their own suppressed laughter. The court reporter's fingers paused over her keys for just a moment before resuming their steady dance. Eloane heard it all. She absorbed every note of mockery, every whispered comment, every shift in the room's energy as strangers judged her before a single word had been spoken. She didn't turn around. Didn't flinch. Didn't offer Fenric the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she opened her folder and removed a single sheet of paper, which she placed face down on the table in front of her. Then she folded her hands again and waited. The gallery settled into expectant silence as the bailiff's voice cut through the room. All rise. The Honorable Judge Daryl Rowan presiding. Judge Rowan entered from the side door with the measured pace of someone who had seen every courtroom drama imaginable and remained unimpressed by all of them. He was in his late 50s, with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that gave nothing away. No warmth, no hostility, just focused attention. His reputation preceded him. A former prosecutor known for dismantling fraudulent financial schemes, he had no patience for theatrics and even less tolerance for deception. Attorneys who tried to charm him found themselves talking to a wall. Those who tried to intimidate him discovered they were children playing with toys. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and surveyed the room with the calm assessment of an architect reviewing blueprints. "Be seated," he said, and the room obeyed in a unified rustle of fabric and creaking wood. Judge Rowan's gaze moved from Fenrick's side of the courtroom, taking in the legal arsenal arrayed there, to Eloan's solitary position at the defense table. His expression didn't change, but something in the pause suggested calculation. "Mrs. Isidore," he said, his voice carrying the weight of formality, "I see you've chosen to represent yourself in these proceedings. Do you understand the risks inherent in such a decision?" This was the moment, the inflection point, the instant where Eloan could still retreat, could still admit that she was in over her head, could still request a continuance to secure proper representation. Instead, she stood, not hurriedly, not defensively. She rose with the same unhurried grace she'd shown entering the room, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand completely." Fenrick leaned toward his lead attorney and whispered something that made the man's shoulders shake with silent amusement. The gesture was deliberate, performed for the gallery's benefit. "Look how little threat she poses. Look how unconcerned we are." But Judge Rowan didn't look at Fenrick. He was still watching Eloan, and now there was something different in his gaze. Interest, perhaps, or simply the attentiveness of someone who had learned not to judge books by their covers. "Very well," he said slowly. "Then let's proceed." Eloan sat back down. Across from her, Fenrick's smile had settled into something permanent, a fixture of his face that broadcast victory before the battle had even begun. What Fenrick didn't know, what none of them knew, except perhaps the judge, who was paid to notice details others missed, was that Eloan hadn't walked into this courtroom unprepared. She hadn't walked in desperate, or naive, or hopelessly outmatched. She had walked in with a plan that had been years in the making. Because while Fenrick had been busy building his public empire, the one with his name on buildings, his face in business magazines, his handshake deals with politicians and power brokers, Eloan had been building something else entirely. She'd been building a record, a timeline, an archive of every signature, every transfer, every quiet conversation where Fenrick had promised her later and delivered never. She'd been building the truth. And in a courtroom, under the watchful eye of Judge Daryl Rowan, truth had a way of being louder than laughter. Fenrick Galen Isidore was a man who understood power. He'd built his fortune in real estate, transforming abandoned warehouses into luxury condos, turning overlooked neighborhoods into destination districts. His face appeared regularly in the business section of newspapers, usually accompanied by words like visionary and titan. City council members took his calls. Investors courted his attention. At charity galas, he commanded the center of every room. What those articles never mentioned, what those investors never knew, was that Fenrick's empire had been built on a foundation he didn't construct alone. Eloan had been there from the beginning. Not beside him in photographs. Fenrick had always preferred to stand alone in those, but behind the scenes, in the late-night strategy sessions, in the financial modeling that turned ambitious ideas into viable investments. She'd been the one who drafted the partnership agreements while Fenrick charmed potential collaborators. She'd been the one who negotiated with property owners when Fenrick's bombastic approach would have destroyed deals before they began. She'd been the architect while he played the showman. And for years, that arrangement had seemed like partnership. Fenrick would tell her she was invaluable, indispensable, the smartest person he knew. He'd promise her recognition was coming, that her name would be on the company documents just as soon as the next deal closed, the next quarter ended, the next milestone was reached. Later became his favorite word. And Eloane, who loved him, who believed in the vision they were supposedly building together, had accepted later as a promissory note that would eventually be honored. Until 18 months ago, when she discovered that later had quietly become never, and her name had been erased from company records entirely, right before Fenrich's businesses hit their highest valuation in history. That discovery had changed something fundamental. Not just in their marriage, but in Eloane herself. She'd realized she'd been cast in a role she'd never auditioned for. The supportive wife, the behind-the-scenes helper, the person whose contributions could be written out of history with a few strategic document amendments and careful omissions. But Eloane had never been good at accepting roles other people wrote for her. So she'd begun writing her own script. The bailiff called the court to order officially, and Fenrich's lead attorney, Mr. Garrison Cole, a man whose win record in family court was legendary and whose hourly rate was obscene, rose to deliver opening statements. He painted a picture of Fenrich as a self-made success story, a man who'd risked everything to build something from nothing. He described Eloane as a supportive spouse who had certainly contributed to the household but whose role in the businesses had been peripheral at best. He spoke of marital gifts and standard support, and the natural division between professional achievement and personal relationship. He spoke for 12 minutes, and every word was designed to diminish Eloane's existence to footnote status. When he sat down, looking pleased with himself, Judge Rowan turned to Eloane. "Mrs. Isidore, would you like to make an opening statement?" Eloane stood again. This time, she picked up the paper she'd placed face down on the table. She didn't look at it. She'd memorized its contents long ago, but holding it seemed to give her hand something to do, a physical anchor in a moment that could easily become overwhelming. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying more strength now, "my husband's attorney just told you a story. It's a good story. It's the story Fenrich has been telling himself and telling the world for years. But it's not the truth." Across the aisle, Garrison Cole's pen stopped moving. Fenrich's smile flickered, just for a second. "The truth," Eloane continued, "is that I didn't support Fenrich's empire. I helped build it. I designed the investment models that convinced our first backers to take a chance on an untested developer. I negotiated the land acquisition for the Riverside project that became his flagship development. I drafted the partnership agreements that established his credibility with larger firms. And I did all of this not as a hobby, not as wifely encouragement, but as an equal partner in what I believed was our shared vision." She paused, letting the words settle into the room like snow accumulating on branches. "What I'm here to prove, Your Honor, is not that I deserve sympathy. I'm here to prove that I deserve recognition for what I actually did. And I'm here to show that when my contributions became inconvenient to Fenrich's narrative, he didn't just minimize them. He tried to erase them entirely." She sat down. The courtroom was quieter now. Even the gallery members who'd smirked earlier were leaning forward, suddenly uncertain about what kind of case they were watching. Judge Rowan made a note on his legal pad, his pen moving in slow, deliberate strokes. "Very well," he said. "Mr. Cole, call your first witness." But as the proceedings officially began, as witnesses were sworn in and evidence was entered into record, as the formal machinery of justice ground into motion, one thing had already shifted. Fenrich wasn't smiling anymore. And Eloane's worn leather folder, still sitting closed on the table in front of her, suddenly looked less like the prop of someone unprepared and more like the weapon of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment for a very long time. Garrison Cole approached the witness stand with the confidence of a man who had never lost a case he expected to win. His first witness was Fenrich himself, a strategic choice designed to establish the narrative before Eloane could challenge it. Fenrich took the oath with his hands steady on the Bible, his voice clear and authoritative. He settled into the witness chair as if it were a throne, adjusting his cufflinks with casual precision before folding his hands in his lap. "Mr. Isidore," Cole began, his tone warm and inviting, "please tell the court about the origins of Isidore Development Group." Fenrich smiled, not the mocking grin from earlier, but something softer, almost nostalgic. "I started with nothing, Your Honor. Just an idea and a willingness to take risks nobody else would take. In 2011, I identified the Riverside District as undervalued real estate with enormous potential. Everyone told me I was crazy to invest in that area, but I saw what it could become. And your wife's involvement in this venture? Eloan was supportive, of course. Every successful man needs a supportive spouse. She encouraged me, helped me stay focused during the difficult early years. But the vision, the risk, the business acumen, that was mine. Cole nodded sagely, as if this confirmed some universal truth. And the initial capital for the Riverside project? Where did that come from? My personal savings, some loans, and a contribution from Eloan. A marital gift, really. She wanted to support the dream we both believed in. A gift, Cole repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Not an investment? Not a business transaction? No. A gift. Between husband and wife. Fenrich's expression was earnest, convincing. I'm grateful for her faith in me during those early days. The testimony continued in this vein for another 20 minutes. Fenrich painted himself as the visionary, the risk-taker, the architect of success. Eloan appeared in his narrative only as atmospheric detail, the supportive wife in the background, cheering from the sidelines while the real work happened elsewhere. When Cole finished, he returned to his seat looking satisfied. The gallery had listened attentively, some nodding along with Fenrich's story. It was compelling, believable. The classic American success narrative, one man's determination transforming nothing into empire. Judge Rowan turned to Eloan. Cross-examination, Mrs. Isidore? Eloan stood, and this time when she moved, there was something different in her posture. A sharpness, a focus that hadn't been visible before. She picked up her worn folder and removed a document, holding it carefully. Mr. Isidore, she began, her voice calm and measured, you testified that you identified the Riverside District as an investment opportunity in 2011. Is that correct? Yes. And that the vision was entirely yours? Yes. Eloan nodded slowly as if considering this. Then she approached the witness stand and handed Fenrich a piece of paper. Can you identify this document? Fenrich took it, his eyes scanning the page. A muscle in his jaw tightened. It appears to be an investment analysis. Can you read the name at the top of the document, please? The pause. Eloan Dariel Isidore. And the date? March 2011. 2 months before you claimed to have identified the Riverside opportunity. Eloan's tone remained neutral, factual. This is a comprehensive market analysis of the Riverside District, including projected development costs, demographic trends, and a 15-year ROI forecast. I wrote this, Mr. Isidore. You presented it to your first investors under your name. Garrison Cole was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Mrs. Isidore is testifying, not asking questions. Sustained. Mrs. Isidore, please phrase your statements as questions. Of course, Your Honor. Eloan turned back to Fenrich. Did you present my analysis to investors under your name? Fenrich's hand tightened on the paper. We worked together on many things. The details of who wrote what became blurred. Blurred, Eloan repeated softly. She returned to her table and retrieved another document. Let's talk about the initial capital you mentioned. You called my contribution a marital gift. Is that still your testimony? Yes. Eloan approached again, handing him a new document. Can you identify your signature on this notarized agreement dated April 2011? Fenrich stared at the paper. The courtroom waited. It's my signature. Can you read the header, please? His voice came out quieter now. Investment agreement and profit-sharing terms. Not a gift, then. An investment. With repayment schedules, profit-sharing percentages, and your signature acknowledging these terms. Eloan paused, letting the contradiction settle. Were you lying then, Mr. Isidore, or are you lying now? Objection. Withdrawn. Eloan returned to her table, but the damage was done. The courtroom's energy had shifted, subtle, but unmistakable. People were sitting straighter, paying closer attention. Judge Rowan leaned forward slightly. Mr. Isidore, I'm going to need clarification on this discrepancy. Fenric adjusted his tie, a gesture that looked less confident than defensive. The agreement was complicated. Marriage and business became intertwined. I may have simplified the nature of the arrangement in my earlier testimony. Simplified, Judge Rowan said, his tone suggesting the word was insufficient. Continue, Mrs. Isidore. But Eloan was already moving to her next play. Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness. Silas Marin. The name rippled through Fenric's legal team like an electric shock. Garrison Cole's head snapped toward his client. Fenric's face had gone pale. A man in his mid-50s entered from the gallery, salt and pepper hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the rumpled appearance of someone more comfortable with spreadsheets than courtrooms. He was sworn in and took the witness stand, nodding politely toward Judge Rowan. Mr. Marin, Eloan began, can you state your former position? I was Chief Financial Officer of Isidore Development Group from 2012 to 2020. And during that time, did you work with Mrs. Eloan Isidore? Extensively. Eloan approved every major budget allocation. She signed off on property acquisitions, reviewed quarterly financial projections, and made final decisions on investment priorities. Fenric's lead attorney shot to his feet. Your Honor, Mr. Marin's employment ended contentiously. His testimony is clearly biased. Mr. Cole, Judge Rowan interrupted, you'll have an opportunity for cross-examination. Sit down. Silas continued, his voice steady. I reported to both Mr. and Mrs. Isidore. In practice, most of my strategic direction came from Eloan. She understood the financial architecture better than anyone I've worked with, before or since. Why wasn't this common knowledge? Silas glanced at Fenric, something like regret crossing his features. I was instructed to refer to all decisions as Mr. Isidore's directives in official communications. For branding purposes, I was told. The company needed one clear public face. And who gave you those instructions? Mr. Fenric Isidore. The gallery murmured. Judge Rowan made another note, his pen moving faster now. Eloan thanked Silas and called her second witness, Callista Wren, a senior property developer in her late 40s with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent decades reading contracts and people with equal skill. Ms. Wren, how do you know the Isidores? I negotiated property deals with them, or rather with Eloan, from 2013 through 2018. Some of Isidore Development's most profitable acquisitions. Can you describe Mrs. Isidore's role in those negotiations? Callista didn't hesitate. She was the negotiator. Fenric would show up for the initial meetings, shake hands, make the vision speech. But when it came to actual terms, price points, contingencies, development timelines, Eloan handled everything. She was brilliant at it. Found leverage points nobody else saw. And who received public credit for these deals? Fenric. Always Fenric. Press releases, interviews, industry awards. His name, his face. I always wondered why Eloan stayed in the background. She was better at this than he was. Garrison Cole's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. Both witnesses held firm, their testimonies corroborated by documentation Eloan had meticulously preserved, emails, meeting notes, signed contracts. By the time the second witness was dismissed, the courtroom had transformed. The gallery members who'd smirked at Eloan's entrance were now watching with rapt attention. Fenric's legal team was no longer bored. They were huddled together, whispering urgently, their earlier confidence replaced by something that looked like concern. Judge Rowan was fully engaged now, his earlier neutrality sharpening into focused scrutiny. And Fenric had stopped smiling entirely. Eloan returned to her table and opened her folder one more time. She removed a thin stack of documents, perhaps 20 pages, and approached the bench. Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence regarding corporate record modifications. She handed copies to the judge and to Garrison Cole. These are company registration documents for Isidore Development Group, spanning from 2011 to present. Judge Rowan began reviewing the pages, his eyebrows drawing together. Eloan continued, her voice steady but carrying an edge now. You'll notice that my name appears on all corporate documents from 2011 through August of 2023. I'm listed as co-founder and equal partner. But in September 2023, 18 months ago, my name was removed. Quietly. Without my knowledge or consent. She pulled out another document. This is the company valuation from August 2023. The highest in company history. And this, she produced a final paper, is Fenrick's filing for divorce, dated October 2023. 2 months after my name was erased from the businesses I helped build. The courtroom went completely silent. Judge Rowan looked up from the documents, his gaze moving slowly to Fenrick. Mr. Isidore, did you remove your wife's name from corporate records prior to filing for divorce? Fenrick opened his mouth. Closed it. His attorneys were frantically conferring, but no one seemed to have an answer that wouldn't make things worse. Mr. Isidore, Judge Rowan repeated, his voice harder now, I asked you a direct question. Fenrick's eyes darted to his lawyers, to the gallery, anywhere but the judge's face. There were legitimate business reasons. What reasons? Silence. Judge Rowan set down his pen with deliberate care, the small sound somehow louder than a gavel strike. I'm going to request a detailed explanation of these modifications, Mr. Cole. And I'm going to want to understand the precise timeline of corporate restructuring relative to divorce proceedings. He looked at Eloan, and for the first time, something that might have been respect flickered across his features. Mrs. Isidore, do you have additional evidence related to this matter? I do, Your Honor. Substantial additional evidence. Then I think we should hear it. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. Mr. Isidore, Mr. Cole, I suggest you spend this evening reviewing your client's corporate actions very carefully. The gavel fell. The gallery erupted in whispers. Fenrick sat frozen in his chair, staring at nothing. His attorneys gathered their materials with mechanical efficiency, their faces carefully blank. And Eloan, standing alone at her table, carefully placed her documents back into her worn leather folder and allowed herself the smallest, quietest breath of satisfaction. The truth, it seemed, was louder than anyone had expected. The courtroom felt different on the second day. The air carried a weight it hadn't possessed 24 hours earlier, anticipation mixed with something sharper, more volatile. The gallery filled quickly, spectators claiming seats as if afraid of missing something crucial. Word had spread. What had begun as a routine divorce case had transformed into something far more compelling. Fenrick entered flanked by his attorneys, his suit immaculate as always, but the ease in his movements had diminished. He sat with careful precision, his jaw set in a way that suggested a night spent rehearsing responses and fortifying defenses. Eloan arrived moments later, alone as before, carrying the same worn leather folder. But today she moved with visible purpose. She'd proven something yesterday, to the court, to the gallery, perhaps even to herself. She was no longer the woman being laughed at. She was the woman asking questions that had no good answers. Judge Rowan took his seat promptly at 9. We'll continue with Mrs. Isidore's presentation of evidence. Mrs. Isidore, you indicated yesterday that you had substantial additional documentation regarding corporate record modifications. I do, Your Honor. But before I present those documents, I'd like to recall Mr. Isidore to the stand for further cross-examination. Garrison Cole stood immediately. Your Honor, my client has already testified extensively, and Mrs. Isidore is entitled to complete her cross-examination. Mr. Isidore, please retake the stand. Fenrick rose slowly. The confidence that had armored him yesterday had developed cracks, small fissures that became more visible as he crossed the courtroom. He settled into the witness chair, and this time when he adjusted his cufflinks, the gesture looked less casual and more like a man searching for something to do with his hands. Eloan stood, but she didn't approach the witness stand immediately. Instead, she remained at her table, her posture relaxed, her voice clear. Mr. Isidore, before we married in 2011, did we sign a prenuptial agreement? No. Did I ever, at any point during our marriage, sign documents relinquishing my ownership rights to the businesses we built together? Fenrick hesitated. Not formally. Not formally, Eloan repeated. So that's a no? No. You didn't sign such documents. Did you remove my name from corporate filings without my knowledge or consent? The question hung in the air. Fenrick's attorney leaned forward, clearly wanting to object but unable to find grounds. The answer was already evident in the documents submitted yesterday. The business was evolving, Fenrick said finally. We needed to streamline decision-making processes. Mr. Isidore, the question requires a yes or no answer. Did you remove my name from corporate filings without my knowledge or consent? His fingers tightened on the armrest. Yes. A collective intake of breath swept through the gallery. Even expecting the answer, hearing Fenrick admit it carried weight that documentation alone could not. Eloan picked up a single sheet of paper from her table and walked toward the witness stand. Her heels clicked against the floor in the silence, each step measured and deliberate. I'd like you to read this email, Mr. Isidore. Out loud, please. She handed him the paper. Fenrick took it, his eyes scanning the text. His face went pale. Mr. Isidore? Judge Rowan prompted. Fenrick cleared his throat. His voice, when he spoke, had lost its earlier authority. It's an email from me to potential investors, dated June 2014. Please read the relevant portion. The section I've highlighted. Fenrick's jaw worked. Then, quietly, he began, Eloan handles the financial backbone of our operations. Her analysis and strategic planning have been instrumental in every successful acquisition we've made. Without her expertise, none of this works. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Garrison Cole's head dropped into his hands. The other attorneys at Fenrick's table sat frozen, their carefully constructed narrative collapsing like a building with a flawed foundation. Eloan let the words settle, let them sink into the consciousness of everyone present. Then she spoke, her voice soft but carrying clearly through the space. You wrote that, Mr. Isidore. To investors. People whose money depended on knowing exactly who was running your company and how competently it was being run. You told them the truth, that I was essential, that nothing worked without me. But in this courtroom, under oath, you called me a supportive spouse with minimal involvement. She paused, letting him feel the contradiction's full weight. Which version was the lie, Mr. Isidore? The one you told investors? Or the one you told this court? Fenrick opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His attorney started to rise, then seemed to think better of it and sank back into his chair. Judge Rowan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Fenrick with an intensity that suggested he'd moved beyond neutral arbitration into active investigation. Mr. Isidore, I'd like to hear your answer to that question. I may have understated Eloan's contributions in my initial testimony. Understated, Judge Rowan said, the single word carrying enough skepticism to fill volumes. That's an interesting characterization. Eloan returned to her table, but she wasn't finished. She retrieved a manila envelope, thicker than the documents she'd presented before, and approached the bench. Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence of financial instruments created in anticipation of divorce proceedings. Every eye in the courtroom fixed on that envelope. Garrison Cole went very still. Eloan opened it carefully and removed a bound document. This is a private trust, registered under the name of Serafina Isidore, Mr. Isidore's sister, in July 2023. 2 months before my name was removed from corporate records, and 3 months before Mr. Isidore filed for divorce. She handed copies to Judge Rowan and Garrison Cole. The judge began reading immediately, his expression darkening with each page. The trust contains assets valued at approximately $18 million, Eloan continued, her voice steady despite the enormity of the figure. Assets that were part of our marital holdings. Properties, investment accounts, company shares, all quietly transferred into this trust structure. She produced another document. This is an amendment to that trust, dated September 2023, the same month my name was removed from corporate filings. The amendment specifically excludes me as a potential beneficiary and consolidates control under Mr. Isidore's sister, with Mr. Isidore maintaining management authority. The gallery was no longer whispering. People sat in stunned silence, watching as the architecture of deception was laid bare. Mr. Isidore, Eloan said, turning back to face him on the witness stand, When you confronted me about wanting a divorce, what did you tell me about protecting your future? Fenric stared at her, recognition and fear mixing in his eyes. I don't remember the exact words. I do. You said, I've worked too hard to build this empire to risk losing it now. I'm protecting my future. She pulled out one more document, a phone log. This conversation occurred on September 12, 2023. 3 weeks after you amended the trust to remove my name. You'd already taken steps to hide our assets. You'd already begun erasing me. And then you had the audacity to tell me you were protecting your future. Judge Rowan set down the trust documents with controlled force. Mr. Cole, I'm going to need a comprehensive explanation of these financial maneuvers. And Mr. Isidore, I'm going to need it from you directly. Fenric looked at his attorneys, but they had no rescue to offer. Garrison Cole's face had taken on the grayish pallor of a man watching his perfect record crumble. Your Honor, Fenric began, his voice hoarse, the trust was created for legitimate estate planning purposes. Estate planning, Judge Rowan interrupted, typically doesn't involve removing a spouse from beneficiary status while you're still married. It doesn't involve transferring assets into family members' names months before filing for divorce. And it certainly doesn't involve documenting all of this while simultaneously claiming in divorce filings that marital assets are minimal. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving between Fenric and his legal team. What this looks like, Mr. Isidore, is a pattern of concealment. A systematic attempt to hide marital assets in advance of divorce proceedings. And what concerns me even more is that this appears to have been done while Mrs. Isidore was being actively written out of the very businesses she helped establish. Garrison Cole finally found his voice. Your Honor, we'd like to request a recess to review these new materials and prepare a proper response. I'm sure you would, Mr. Cole, but I'm not particularly interested in giving you time to construct explanations for what looks remarkably like fraud. Judge Rowan's tone had shifted from neutral to openly skeptical. Mrs. Isidore, do you have additional evidence? I have documentation of every asset transfer, Your Honor. Bank statements, property deeds, corporate restructuring memos. I've been tracking these movements for 18 months. 18 months, Judge Rowan repeated, a note of something almost like admiration entering his voice. You've been building a case for 18 months while your husband believed you were unaware of his actions. Yes, Your Honor. I believed then, as I believe now, that truth is best served by thorough documentation. The judge nodded slowly, then turned his attention back to Fenric. Mr. Isidore, I'm going to be direct with you. What I'm seeing here suggests a coordinated effort to defraud your spouse of her rightful share of marital assets. The timing of these transfers, the removal of Mrs. Isidore from corporate records, the creation of trusts designed to shield assets. This is not standard divorce planning. This is concealment. Fenric's face had gone from pale to ashen. His hands gripped the witness stand armrests so tightly his knuckles were white. We're going to recess for 30 minutes, Judge Rowan announced, his tone brooking no argument. When we return, Mr. Cole, I expect you and your client to be prepared to address these trust documents in full detail. Mrs. Isidore, please have your additional documentation ready for submission. The gavel fell. Fenric remained in the witness stand for a moment, as if unable to process that he was dismissed. When he finally stood, his movements were those of someone who'd aged a decade overnight. His attorneys surrounded him immediately, their urgent whispers barely audible as they ushered him toward the side door. The gallery exploded into conversation the moment the judge exited. Reporters pulled out phones. Spectators leaned across aisles to share observations and theories. And Eloan sat alone at her table, carefully organizing her documents back into their proper order, her face calm, her hands steady. But if someone had looked closely, if anyone had been paying attention to her rather than to the drama unfolding around her, they might have noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she closed her folder. They might have seen the way she exhaled, long and slow, as if releasing tension she'd been holding for months. Because Eloan knew something that Fenric was only beginning to understand. The truth, once exposed, couldn't be hidden again. And she had saved the most devastating truths for last. In 30 minutes, everything Fenric had built, every lie, every concealment, every erasure, would collapse completely. The 30-minute recess stretched like hours. Eloan remained in the courtroom, declining to step outside where reporters lurked and spectators gossiped. She sat at her table, hands folded over her worn leather folder, breathing slowly and deliberately. Around her, the gallery buzzed with speculation and commentary, but she existed in a pocket of stillness, preparing herself for what came next. Through the side door's narrow window, she could see Fenric and his attorneys in heated discussion. Garrison Cole's gestures had become sharp, frustrated. The other attorneys stood with arms crossed, their expressions suggesting they'd run out of viable strategies. And Fenric stood with his back to them, staring at the wall, his shoulders carrying a weight they hadn't borne when this case began. Eloan felt something unexpected then, not triumph, but a quiet, complicated sadness. This had been her life once. There had been love there, however distorted it became. There had been shared dreams, late-night conversations, moments of genuine partnership before ambition and ego poisoned everything good between them. But sentiment couldn't erase what Fenric had done. It couldn't restore what he'd tried to take. And Eloan had learned, through years of being diminished and erased, that sometimes the only path forward required burning the bridge you'd once crossed together. The bailiff's voice cut through the gallery noise. "All rise." Judge Rowan entered, his expression graver than before, carrying not just his standard legal pad but the full file of evidence Eloan had submitted. He settled into his chair with the deliberate movements of someone who'd made difficult decisions and intended to stand by them. "Be seated." He opened the file, reviewing pages in silence while the courtroom held its breath. Finally, he looked up, his gaze moving first to Fenric, then to Eloan, then back to Fenric with an intensity that made several gallery members lean forward. "I've reviewed the trust documents, the corporate records, the financial transfers, and the timeline Mrs. Isidore has meticulously documented. I've also reviewed the email evidence, the witness testimonies, and Mr. Isidore's own admissions from yesterday and this morning." He paused, the silence heavy with implication. "What I'm seeing is not a case of marital discord or simple asset division. What I'm seeing is systematic fraud." Garrison Cole rose halfway from his chair. "Your Honor, that characterization is accurate," Judge Rowan said flatly. "Sit down, Mr. Cole." The attorney sank back into his seat, his face flushed. Judge Rowan continued, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority and personal conviction. "Mr. Isidore, you stood in this courtroom and portrayed yourself as a self-made success while diminishing your wife's contributions to footnote status. You called her financial investment a gift, despite having signed agreements documenting it as a formal business arrangement. You removed her name from corporate records at the precise moment your company reached peak valuation. And you transferred $18 million in marital assets into a trust designed specifically to exclude her, all while preparing to file for divorce." He set down his pen with deliberate care. "This is not estate planning. This is not business restructuring. This is concealment with the intent to defraud a spouse of her rightful share of marital property. And it demonstrates a pattern of behavior designed to erase Mrs. Isidore's role in building the very empire you claim as solely yours." Fenric sat motionless, his face drained of color. The confident posture, the casual arrogance, the self-assured smile, all of it had evaporated, leaving behind someone who looked smaller somehow, diminished not by the courtroom but by the exposure of his own actions. Judge Rowan picked up the trust documents. "Regarding the private trust registered under Serafina Isidore, I am ruling that all assets transferred into this trust are marital property and must be divided accordingly. The trust structure was created with the intent to shield assets from equitable distribution, which violates both the spirit and letter of matrimonial law." Garrison Cole made no move to object. His colleagues sat frozen. "Regarding corporate ownership, Mrs. Isidore has provided irrefutable evidence that she was an equal partner in the creation and operation of Isidore Development Group and all subsidiary businesses. Her removal from corporate records was done without her consent and coincided suspiciously with both peak company valuation and divorce preparation. I am therefore ruling that Mrs. Isidore is entitled to 50% ownership of all businesses established during the marriage, including Isidore Development Group, Riverside Properties LLC, and Isidore Investment Holdings. A ripple of gasps moved through the gallery. One reporter dropped her pen. Someone in the back row whispered, "Holy hell!" Judge Rowan wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering a complete forensic audit of all financial transactions between Mr. Isidore and family members over the past 2 years. If additional concealed assets are discovered, Mrs. Isidore will be entitled to appropriate compensation, and Mr. Isidore may face contempt charges. He closed the file and looked directly at Fenric. Mr. Isidore, you came into this courtroom confident that power and expensive legal representation would ensure your desired outcome. But this court is not impressed by confidence. It is impressed by evidence, by truth, and by the basic principle that marriage is a partnership, legal, financial, and otherwise. You attempted to erase that partnership. Mrs. Isidore has proven it existed, and this ruling reflects that reality. Judge Rowan turned to Eloan, and something in his expression softened, not familiarity, but recognition. Professional respect. Mrs. Isidore, I want to commend you for the thoroughness of your documentation and the clarity of your presentation. Self-representation in cases of this complexity is rarely advisable, but you have demonstrated that preparation and truth can be more powerful than any legal team. He paused. Your case has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt. This court finds in your favor on all material points. The gavel fell. The sound seemed to release a dam. The gallery erupted, not in whispers this time, but in open exclamations of shock and satisfaction. Reporters surged toward the aisle, already calling their editors. Spectators turned to their neighbors with wide eyes and animated gestures. But Eloan barely heard any of it. She sat very still at her table, her hands still folded over her folder, and for the first time in 2 years, perhaps longer, she allowed herself to simply breathe. Not the shallow, controlled breaths of someone holding themselves together through sheer will, but deep, full breaths that filled her lungs and released something she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Relief. Vindication. Freedom. Across the aisle, Fenric remained in his chair, staring at nothing. His attorneys were gathering their materials with mechanical efficiency, their faces carefully neutral but their movements speaking volumes about defeat. Garrison Cole approached Fenric, said something in a low voice, but Fenric didn't appear to hear him. He simply sat there, a man who'd built an empire on foundations that were never entirely his own, now facing the reality that his name alone couldn't hold up what 2 people had created together. Eloan stood slowly. She picked up her worn leather folder, the same one she'd carried into this courtroom 2 days ago, when Fenric had laughed at the sight of her standing alone. She tucked it under her arm, nodded respectfully to Judge Rowan, and walked toward the exit. As she passed Fenric's table, she didn't look at him. There was nothing left to say, no final words that would add meaning to what had already been decided. Their story had ended not with confrontation, but with documentation. Not with anger, but with truth. The courtroom doors closed behind her with the same heavy creak they'd made when she entered. But everything else had changed. The office occupied the 23rd floor of a building that overlooked the city's downtown corridor, the same view Fenric had once claimed as exclusively his kingdom. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, glass and steel monuments to ambition and success. But the name on the door now read, Eloan Dariel Advisory Strategy. Integrity. Ownership. Eloan stood at those windows, coffee in hand, watching the morning light paint the building's gold. Behind her, the office hummed with purposeful activity. Analysts reviewed market projections. Architects sketched development proposals. Legal consultants prepared contracts for clients who'd specifically sought out Eloan's expertise after news of the trials spread through professional networks. And women, so many women, who'd been told to stay behind the scenes, to let others take credit, to be content with support roles. They worked at the desks and conference tables of Eloan Dariel Advisory, their names on their office doors, their contributions acknowledged and valued. Eloan, her assistant, Maya, appeared in the doorway. The Riverside Development team is ready for your review. I'll be right there. Eloan took one last look at the skyline. Somewhere in this city, Fenric still operated his businesses, now legitimately shared with Eloan, the financial arrangement court-mandated and transparent. His empire still existed, still generated revenue, still bore his name on some buildings. But it no longer erased her. She had extracted herself from the narrative he'd written, where she appeared only as a footnote, and had rewritten the structure entirely. Not out of revenge. Revenge required maintaining emotional connection, and Eloan had severed that connection the moment Judge Rowan's gavel fell. She'd done it because the truth had required correction, and she was the only one who could provide it. In her pocket, her phone buzzed. A message from Silas Marin, the former CFO who'd testified on her behalf. "Congratulations on the Henderson acquisition. You're doing what you always should have been doing, leading from the front instead of the shadows." Eloan smiled and pocketed the phone. She set down her coffee, straightened her jacket, and walked toward the conference room where her team waited, not behind anyone, not supporting someone else's vision, but building her own. There's a lesson in what happened in that courtroom, one that extends beyond legal victories and financial settlements. Never mistake silence for ignorance. Eloan had been silent for years, not because she lacked voice, but because she'd believed partnership meant supporting someone else's spotlight while she worked in the shadows. She'd been silent while Fenric took credit, while her name disappeared from records, while the architecture of erasure was constructed around her. But silence, it turned out, had given her something unexpected: time. Time to document. Time to prepare. Time to build an irrefutable case from the fragments Fenric thought he'd successfully scattered. When Fenric laughed at the sight of her defending herself in court, he made the fatal error of equating her silence with weakness. He assumed that because she'd allowed him the spotlight, she'd forgotten she'd built the stage. He believed that because she'd let him claim credit, she'd lost track of what was rightfully hers. He was wrong. Preparation, Eloan proved, is louder than confidence. Truth doesn't require permission to surface, it simply requires someone patient enough to document it, brave enough to present it, and strong enough to stand alone while doing so. The courtroom had been designed to intimidate her. The attorneys were hired to overwhelm her. The laughter was meant to humiliate her into retreat. But Eloan understood something that Fenric never grasped. Power built on erasure isn't power at all. It's an illusion, fragile as morning mist, and it collapses the moment truth enters the room. When they laugh at you for standing alone, remember this. They're laughing because they don't yet understand what you know. They don't see the years of documentation you've quietly compiled. They don't recognize the strength it takes to be underestimated and use that underestimation as armor. They don't realize that you've been preparing for this moment while they were busy congratulating themselves on victories that were never entirely theirs. And by the time they stop laughing, by the time they understand what you've built in the silence they mistook for submission, it's already too late. The truth has entered the room. And once it's there, once it's spoken and documented and proven beyond doubt, it cannot be erased. Not by laughter. Not by expensive attorneys. Not by confidence or power or the desperate attempts of those who built empires on foundations they didn't lay alone. Eloan Dariel Isidore walked into that courtroom alone, carrying only a worn leather folder and the truth. She walked out with everything that was rightfully hers. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.